See that? So thank you for tuning into my presentation and to the conference organizers who managed to pull this together in such exceptional circumstances. My name is Maria, and in this talk I'll be discussing an exploratory study which aimed to find timbral correlates for common effective verbal descriptors used to describe electronic dance music on the online record retailer BOOMKAT.com. So varying notions of affect have been central to the academic literature on EDM, or electronic dance music, since the 1990s, with it often portrayed as the singular motivating force behind and distinguishing feature of electronic dance music and culture. For these writers, the value of EDM is seen to be its ability to produce singular intensities that modulate bodily capacities while circumventing conscious meaning making. It's important to underscore that the most common definition of affect in this literature is different than that used in psychology and neuroscience, and is based predominantly on the Spinoza-Deleuze-Guattari-Massumi paradigm, which, according to Ruth Lees, prizes the non-semantic, the non-linear, the vital, the singular, the indeterminate, and the disruption of fixed or conventional meanings. All attributes which privilege difference over identity and non-conscious embodied becoming over conscious deliberation and specificity. Such emphases on ineffability, in-betweenness, and vitality also mark the fragile musicological consensus on timbre, which conceives of timbre as reflectively unconscious vital relationality, which supersedes binarisms between the acoustic and the perceptual, between the material and the ideal, and between timbre and tone. A concern with materialities, intensities, activation contours, and action trajectories pervades both timbre and affect discourses. These convergences are also played out in everyday conversations about the sounds of music by listeners and practitioners, which often proceed by a vague and fanciful terminology. Studies of user-generated EDM discourse have noticed that EDM fans show a keen awareness of timbre in their music, despite the language being used to express it being marked, like the timbres of EDM themselves, by non-specificity and affectivity. For this project, I wanted to embrace this parallelism and look for timbral underpinnings to the effective language characteristic of the EDM discourse community. My underlying question was, what if the non-specific descriptors of the effective charge of EDM are in fact descriptors of specific timbres? I chose the online record retailer BOOMKAT as the source of my linguistic data because it's well known among EDM fans for its creative use of language in its product descriptions, which is representative of the broader discursive conventions of the EDM scene. As you can see on the slide, their release blurbs are funny, informative, and written in colorful language that, whilst definitely non-specific in music theoretical terms, addressing only vague qualities of movement and metonymically deferring meaning onto other musical styles, it's nonetheless highly evocative of the sounds of the records being described. For my analysis, I used a combination of qualitative, quantitative, and computational methods, bringing approaches from corpus linguistics into the fold of music analysis. In many ways, my aims were similar to those of Zachary Woolmark in his discourse analysis of orchestration treatises, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about tomorrow, and of Zacharakis, Pastiadis, and Rice's work on interlanguage musical timbre semantics, in that I wanted to analyze the language that a real discourse community uses to talk about sound and identify acoustic features that correlated with it. However, my disciplinary background and limited means or resources meant that I was able to do was decidedly more lo-fi and DIY than those studies, and I'd be grateful for any thoughts you may have as to how I could improve my methodology in the questions after the talk. So this paper forms part of a larger study which analysed language data from multiple EDM subgenre categories on the BOOMKAT website using the Voyant text analysis environment, manually classified frequently occurring tropes into inductively derived tropes, and compared the relative weightings of the tropes between genre categories in order to explore the concealed inflections of taste latent in EDM culture. The hypothesis I wanted to test there was whether the different sonic and sociocultural profiles of the subgenres would manifest in different discursive characteristics, which they did. BOOMKAT is a useful corpus for this type of analysis because while it contains only linguistic data, they pertain to real existing pieces of music. So while there's still an awful lot of inference involved, there's no need to create new sound stimuli to match the words or vice versa, as has been necessary in previous studies of this sort. In this paper, the focus is on the techno house subgenre only, and my corpus is made up of data pertaining to 1,027 records released in the year leading up to January 2019, which was scraped from the BOOMKAT website. This bar chart shows the distribution of types, that is individual word forms in blue, and tokens, which are instances of word forms in orange, among the trope categories for all words occurring 4 or more times in the corpus. As you can see, I had a trope category that captured direct, though of course not exhaustive, references to timbre and instrumentation, but this, along with references to rhythm and meter and references to other musical feature, were considerably less prevalent than the affect trope, whose tokens make up about 1/4 of the total. The affect trope is populated by emotive and whimsical terms describing loosely specified sonic properties or the general feel of the music, and it's precisely their slipperiness that aligns them with the investigative aims of this paper. Therefore, the rest of my analysis concerns the 797 types derived from the affect trope. From this large and diverse lexical pool, it's possible to pick out latent subtropes which share underlying semantic structures. For example, terms referring to force, action, and motion, references to material properties like texture, mass, and luminance, explicit cross-modal projections, and so on, as you can see on the slide. Many of these categories are consistent with the types of language that has been shown in various studies to be used to describe timbre. The shared emphases on material, sensory, and activity dimensions especially reinforce the link between theorizations of affect in the humanities and timbre cognition, warranting further analysis of the timbral underpinnings of this effective language. To this end, I have chosen 2 terms, talk and keening, to which I wanted to find timbral correlates in my BOOMKAT corpus. These were chosen on the basis of their idiosyncrasy, frequency of occurrence, and their effective, mimetic, and embodied connotations, which bring them in line with the timbral language we've just been talking about. The standard definition of talk is that it's a force that tends to cause rotation. In terms of embodied image schemata, it implies a 2-step process, so pressure or a downwards force and a perpendicular rotary motion. It also has a haptic dimension through its association with grinding. And keening, on the other hand, is a type of solo female singing originating from the Irish mourning ritual. Characterized by a haunting and wavering wailing sound, which is often devoid of lyrics altogether or sung with barely articulated consonants so that the visceral qualities of the wail are foregrounded. Following the 7 conceptual categories derived from Wallmark's orchestration treatises, keening can be understood as straddling affective, mimetic, acoustic, and action categories, whilst talk exhibits traits of affect, matter, cross-modal correspondence, and action. The presence of these associations in the techno house corpus can be further evidenced by visualizations created with a word embedding projector tool. In this corpus, talk is represented as being closely related to terms like traction, downstroke, and pressure, while keening is related to descriptors like ghostly, gauzy, and wistful. And I mention these to emphasize the perceptual invariance that these related terms share, which suggests a degree of consistency in the linguistic corpus that I believe is a response to what we might think of as stock timbral gestures in the house and techno records being described. In this table, you can see details on the releases whose blurbs featured the terms talk and keening, as well as excerpts from those blurbs. The keening releases are highlighted in yellow and talk in green. Not all of the blurbs used the terms in relation to a named track. Sometimes they were referring to the release as a whole, so these were discounted from the analysis. With the rest, I downloaded the relevant tracks, ran them through Sonic Visualizer, and listened closely to try to see what timbral features they had in common and whether these could be explained in terms of the image schemata and perceptual invariants that were established for talk and keening earlier. The releases that were found to share timbral gestures that I identified as matching the respective terms are highlighted in bold on this table. Before moving on to looking at these in detail, first a quick explanation of what I mean by timbral gesture. So electronic dance music is usually characterized by a modular structure. Different instrumental loops are stacked together in various ways. And these modules are defined rhythmically, of course, but also, and perhaps more importantly, by their timbral profiles. So it's a certainty, for example, that there'll be some kind of 4-bar baseline loop, but the novelty in any track comes from its idiosyncratic timbral characteristics, its amplitude and filter envelopes, waveform, harmonic spectrum, and so on. Following Godot in Leemann's definition of musical gesture as a meaningful sound event produced by a particular action trajectory, and Godoy's re-theorization of Schaeffer's sonorous object into the gestural sonorous object, it seems fitting to me to think of these instrumental patches in EDM as timbral gestures, sonic events united in perception by the projection of a particular kind of real or schematic action trajectory that accounts for their spectrotemporal character. So with that out of the way, we can move on to music analysis. Of the 13 named tracks whose descriptions featured the term keening, I found that 9 had in common a very distinctive gesture that I think the word keening would have been referring to. All of these tracks featured prominent synthesizer lines placed well above the other elements of the mix in the middle or high registers, whose spectromorphologies are characterized by extremely smooth amplitude envelopes and portato glide with almost inaudible attack onsets, slight filter oscillation, and subtle detunings, reverb, and noise elements. The noise and detunings serve to dampen and muffle what would otherwise be quite bright lines with a lot of spectral energy in the upper partials. And we can listen to an example here. So you can hear there that the piano attack has been cut off, mirroring the lack of consonance in sung keening. There's a wavering quality to the sound achieved by subtle amplitude envelope modulation and overt detunings. Here's another example from Perevedentseva with similar things going on. So we'll just listen again. So there's a floating line doubled at the octave, lots of distortion in the lower line of the two which are fused together, and very smooth envelopes. In both of these examples, the association with keening is reinforced by other contextual factors, so the descending melodic contour in the Max Loderbauer track and the hauntological noise in the Par Grinvik, which you've just heard. Moving on to talk, I found that 11 out of 22 tracks which use the descriptor share the timbral gesture that maps onto the perceptual invariance of talk as an embodied action. Specifically, these were characterized by a mid-range synthesizer line doubled by strong sub-bass, an internally dynamic temporal envelope achieved by various combinations of filter, pitch, and amplitude modulation, and they all shared a complex and clearly synthetic harmonic spectrum, made even more complex by a high level of noise and distortion, especially near the attack onset. Here's an example, the Matthew Herbert remix of Ricochet. I'll just turn it down. So in there, we've got the complex resonant mid-range line doubled by LFO modulated bass and a very high amp sub-bass. This serves to perceptually extend the depth of the sound, and the amplitude imbalance between the middle and sub-bass registers creates a sense of downward pull or force that corresponds with torque. Importantly, each note of the synth line is marked by clear filter envelope modulation, which creates a sense of timbral dilation, which maps onto the rotary dimension of torque. And this would have been achieved with a rotary filter knob on a synthesizer or plugin, so there's a clear schematic relation there. The amount of distortion on the gesture also contributes to a cross-modal perception of heightened physical exertion required to produce the sound, which again corresponds to the connotations of grinding and force in talk as a descriptor. This distinctive timbral gesture appeared in only half of all the tracks that were described with the word talk in the house and techno corpus. The rest had more diffuse talk-like properties, mainly just very powerful sub-bass and wide spacing between different elements of the mix that, to me, suggest it was used as a synonym for pressure in these instances. However, I discovered the same talk gesture as in the Ricochet track in a 1997 single called Talk by Ed Rush and Nico. So it's possible that alongside its cross-modal associations, the word is being used as a kind of intertextual reference to this older track. And this brings me on nicely to my conclusions because I see we're running out of time. So in my hybrid musical linguistic corpus derived from BOOMKAT's release blurbs, I found stable correlations between non-specific effective terms and timbral gestures in the tracks they were describing. The examples of talk and keening shared underlying perceptual invariance with timbral features in the tracks surveyed, which were grounded in conceptual metaphor and embodied image schemata, echoing many recent studies that have shown these to be central to timbral cognition. However, the cultural conventions of EDM as a musical discourse community also significantly influenced the suitability of particular words for particular musical features. This is an important ecological factor that should be borne in mind in future studies. Words that may appear vague to outsiders in fact seem to form part of the working vocabulary to community insiders, specifying salient spectromorphological attributes that are recognizable and communicable. And different discourse communities naturally would have their own distinct language which coheres with and reflects the broader musical and cultural values of the groups. If my suspicion that many more terms in this corpus besides talk and keening consistently map onto specific timbral gestures is correct, then perhaps EDM studies could move away from narratives of undifferentiated intensities and undulations, and instead look to the concrete sonic characteristics of the music for answers as to why it affects people the way that it does. Unpacking the parallel preoccupations with materiality, sensation, and action between timbre cognition and affect theory could help to demystify these processes and restore agency to producers and listeners participating in EDM's symbolic economy, who understand particular gestures in specific ways and use them to achieve their desired effects. Once again, I found myself agreeing with Woolmark, who argues that shifting understanding from what timbre is to what it does makes possible an ecological embodied theory of timbre perception. And it's hoped that this study of vernacular or untrained musical discourse community can bring us one tentative step closer to that goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for a great talk. Very much on time. We're actually a little bit over time, but I would still like to grant a question or so if someone has one in the list. What I find most intriguing here is as you say, the interlock between the gestural part and the timbre. So is it at all possible to disentangle this, do you think? The movement part and the effect part from the timbre part? Or is it all integrated?
I think it would be nice if I was able to disentangle them, but I think as I've been going further in my work, I've seen that in these contexts, in EDM specifically, I can't. I think it's very much defined by the shape of this gesture. And I think maybe that again has to do with the fact that it's all very modular, this music. But I think the fact that gesture plays such an important part also ties it into affect as it's conceived in the humanities.
Yes, it does make sense to me, at least. So I see that perhaps other people are also in need of a break. There are no questions, but I would once again like to thank you and all the other speakers. And I'll be happy to see you later on for a poster session and other talks. So once again, thank you all.